Well, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I'm Susan Santone, and I'm here this morning from Ypsilanti, Michigan, which is in southeast Michigan, very close to Detroit. So I didn't come that far, and with that, I want to thank all of you who came from so far away. This is my first ACI conference, and I am really blown away. I've had the opportunity to learn about some of the great work going on, and it's just really humbling and really helped me understand what a privilege it is and an honor to be able to address you this morning. I'm going to be talking about education for sustainability and thinking about the role of education diplomats in this important topic. As many of us know, we just concluded the decade of education for sustainability. So where are we going to go from here? And how does that overlap with the goals and the agenda of being education diplomats? Let me just ask real quick, how many of you are in early childhood? And I know there's going to be a lot, okay? How many of you are in secondary? Okay, one, okay. Teacher preparation, okay, non-governmental organizations. Okay, great. So we have a real variety, and I hope that what I show, you'll see some of your own work in what I'll be talking about. One of the best things I've enjoyed about the conference is getting to hear people's stories about how they got into this work. So let me just share a little bit about how I got into this work. I've been involved in education for sustainability for 25 years. I started Creative Change, a non-governmental organization, in 2002, but before that I was a music major. I was trained in university to be a classically trained orchestral French horn player. And yeah, I know. So what happened? When I was 25, I read a book called Diet for a Small Planet. Has anybody read it? It's an expose on the global food system. And it opened my eyes to things I never even knew. The connections between environmental degradation, between world hunger, gender equity, colonialism, you know, the history of exploitation of indigenous people, and I was just consumed with these issues. And I was like, people have to understand this. This is what I want to teach about. And so I made a commitment, and for the next 15 years, I went back to school. I taught in every situation imaginable. I taught English as a second language. I taught in K-12 classrooms. I taught adults. I taught recent immigrants, and I used every opportunity I could to help people. How can we understand these problems, and more importantly, what can we do? What are the solutions? And that's when I really discovered the power of education to make a difference. So that's where I came across the idea of education for sustainable development, because to help me understand, here is a way, here is a framework for solutions. So that's what I want to talk about this morning. So as you may have seen this diagram. Has anyone seen this diagram? As in one of the many documents that was sent ahead of time. This is the Road to Dignity by 2030. So this is the one conception of sustainable development. And as we can see, and as you probably know, it's a huge topic. How can we protect the planet? How can we ensure equity? How can we ensure dignity, justice, reduce poverty? It's a huge issue. It often feels like it's too much to take on. So as I've been trying to teach about this, I found that this is too much for people to swallow at the beginning. So I'm going to put this all aside for a second, and I want to start with a very, very basic question. And that is, what do we need to thrive? So put the climate change and the world hunger and the gender equity, just put that off to the side just for a second. I want you to think about, what do we need to thrive? Picture your life thriving. Picture you and your family happy and healthy. What comes to mind? Okay, what comes to mind? Just think about that for a second. Okay, so I'm going to make a couple guesses. How many of you thought about healthy food? Okay, how many of you thought about strong relationships, families, friends, communities? How many of you thought about a clean environment? Okay, how many thought of you about the role of education? Okay, so the reason I start with this is because sustainable development can be a contested issue. It can be, there's debate around it. But when I start with this, everybody wants to thrive. Thriving is a shared goal. And so I've worked with educators in conservative communities, in, quote, progressive communities, religious schools. I've worked with people from the military. I've worked with kindergarten teachers, college professors, no matter where I go. And I've asked this question to probably a couple thousand people. It's always the same answer. It's always this list. It's love, it's fulfillment, it's family, it's beauty, it's healthy food. And what I like about this is that even though there's a lot of debate about how we get there, everybody wants to thrive. And it creates a doorway. It creates a welcome mat to open the conversation. And I think as education diplomats, that's one of the main things we can do, is open the door and help people see that there's a shared goal. And thriving is a shared goal. So the next question then is, what supports our ability to thrive? And so when I'm talking about this, I talk about two kinds of things: the natural commons and the social commons. Has anyone heard the term the commons? Okay? It's a term used to talk about the shared gifts that we all depend on and that we have to pass on undiminished to future generations. So the natural commons is sunlight, it's clean water, it's trees, it's forests, it's biodiversity. It's the services provided by bees that pollinate. It's the wetlands that are purifying our water. The social commons are all the elements of culture that make our lives so rich. It's the language, the stories, the heritage, the traditions. And so as I'm teaching about this, I help people understand that we depend on these things together. Just as thriving is a shared goal, our dependence on these shared resources is also shared. And again, this brings people together. And so the key term that I push and the key concept when opening this discussion is interdependence. Who's heard that term? I heard it used a lot yesterday. It goes in with systems thinking, which I heard used yesterday as well. So interdependence is the idea that it's all connected. Clean water, a clean environment, means children, adults, families, communities have healthy water and clean water so that they can thrive. When there's clean water and healthy people, those are the kids that can go to school. They can contribute to their communities. They can contribute towards sustainable development and shared prosperity. And so the key word here is and. It's healthy environments and healthy people. It's clean water and strong economies. So as I'm talking about sustainability, I'm talking about this idea of interdependence, that we're not only all in this together, but these goals are all interrelated. I find it destructive, this idea that, well, we can either have jobs or the environment, take your pick. I find those to be destructive conversations that ignore the reality of interdependence. So again, I start with this because it brings people in, it opens up a conversation, and it helps us understand some shared goals. So this, to me, then, is the fundamental question of sustainability. How can societies be organized in ways that enable us to thrive while sustaining the commons that supports it all? So again, I like this idea of thriving rather than surviving. Oftentimes when I'm in discussions about sustainability, it's about, you have to stop driving that car, you have to stop doing that, you have to stop doing that. And it's a deprivation mentality. Obviously, there will be many changes that are needed, but the idea of thriving is something that everybody can get their heads around. And then I start helping people understand that what's good for the environment is often good for your own health, is often good for your own community, this idea of interdependence. So those are big questions, big ideas. How do we help bring that down into an education context? How do we make that digestible? So I like to use a set of guiding concepts. And I'm going to put them up right here, and I'm going to give you a second to look at those. Okay, and these aren't the only ones out there. But if you take a second and look at those, and some of these we've heard. We've had a lot of talk here about equity. We heard yesterday about systems thinking. We've talked about ethics. We've talked about interdependence. Let me just ask you real quick, I'll just throw a couple out. How many of you see your work as related to resilience and building stronger communities? Wonderful. How many of you see your work about well-being of the child, of the family, of the community? Yes, of course. How many of you see what you're doing is related to a healthy environment? Okay, some, okay. How many of you see what you're doing is related to equity? Okay, so that's why I like these concepts, because it creates such a big tent. Even folks who don't say, oh, I'm an educator for sustainable development, to me, if you're doing these kinds of things, you're contributing to it. You're bringing that skill, you're bringing that expertise into your role as an education diplomat. So that's why I work with these kinds of concepts, whether I'm working with a physical education teacher, a science teacher, history, math, everybody finds a place in these concepts. And so they're broadly applicable across content, across the pedagogy, across educational practice. And I'm going to show a couple of examples. How can these concepts drive instruction? So I'm just going to talk about some of the examples that I've been working with. I work with schools and universities, mainly in the U.S. context, to help them bring these issues into curriculum and instruction. So, so for example, here, this picture of this abandoned building. There's buildings like this all over Detroit. There's vacant buildings, contaminated properties everywhere you look. People of color, low-income people are more likely to live next to them. So we're working with high school students that are studying these properties, looking at the soils, looking at the water. How can we clean them up? How can we turn this building into something productive for the community? All of the while, they're learning about science, hydrology, geology, soils, chemistry. Achievement is going up. So it's this idea, oftentimes, again, people will say, well, sustainability is nice, but that's over there on Earth Day. I've got achievement to worry about. Well, let me tell you what it looks like. Okay, here the hands together. We did a project with our middle school in our community, Ypsilanti. The public schools are 80% black, 80% low income. Detroit is one of the most segregated regions in the nation. They did a class on history, language arts, and racial equity with 12 and 13-year-olds that went deep into land use policies. Why is the region so segregated? What can we do to make a more equitable community? How can we treat each other better in our own school classroom? They went into issues I cover with my college students, and they were working on literacy and writing, and their scores went up 20%. So these are amazing examples of that sustainability isn't something over here for Earth Day. This is about good quality teaching and learning. This is about equity, systems thinking, rigor, providing opportunities for all students, the work that everybody in this room, I think, is contributing to. Food systems, we've been working with schools where, even at the younger grades, using food and health and looking at the food security in the community to do math, to do literacy, and the scores are going up. Looking at the plastics pollution problem. How can we engineer and design products that eliminate this in the first place? Looking at new models of business, looking at new models of economics. So I'm very excited about this work because it shows that it's not either or. If we want rigor, if we want achievement, if we want all students to have a stake in a positive future, to me, these are the kinds of things that can help us get there. So this is the kind of work that I'm excited about. Now, I know many of you are early childhood. So I'll work with young teachers of young students, and they'll say, I'm going to teach my kids about polar bears, and I'm going to have my 5-year-olds save the world. And I say, please don't. Okay? Saving the planet is a really big job for a 5-year-old. Okay? So for young kids, you don't need to be teaching about climate change or polar bears or rainforests to educate for sustainability. For the younger kids, it's about how do we create a happy and healthy world for all. Okay? So if you're engaging youth in connecting with the environment and finding joy in the natural world, you're educating for sustainability. If you're helping kids choose healthy foods and become physically healthy, learn about their local food system, improve their nutrition, you're educating for sustainability. If you're helping kids resolve conflicts, learn to value each other, develop strong friendships and relationships, that's educating for sustainability. So it's not just about teaching climate change, it's about the principles, the values, and those concepts that I put up there. So again, I think it's important to create a very big tent so that everybody sees a role in how are we using education to make the world happier, healthier, more equitable, more just. Okay? At the global level, again, many of you know the Decade of Education for Sustainable Development just concluded. They had the declaration that calls on governments going forward, and there was reading in the pre-conference readings about that. And as I'll talk about, this impacts the policies of education, the classroom practices, some of the examples I showed, and then also the pedagogy. Okay, so what can education diplomats do to shift the needle? Even if you don't identify as somebody who's educating for sustainability, what can education diplomats do? The first thing is recognize that this is a key. I took the language right from the Education Diplomat website because it felt like such a clear connection. Promote peace, prosperity, and sustainable solutions to complex human problems. It's part of the very DNA, the very nature of being an education diplomat. So that's what's exciting to me. The concept of education diplomacy is fairly new for me, and I'm seeing all these wonderful connections, and I hope you do too. So what does that mean? What are some things we can do? The first thing, and probably one of the most important things, is to advocate for the kinds of values that we want to see driving education. Interdependence, education for the common good, equity, cooperation, access to quality education for all, the idea of learning to build wisdom, okay, about how do we live well in this world. I think we need to challenge some of the damaging mindsets, that domination as opposed to interdependence, that education is for private gain versus the common good. There's creeping privatization in the United States, and as I've been talking with people, understand that this is an issue at the global level too. Equity versus hierarchy. The idea that we need to provide access for all as opposed to access for some, ranking and sorting people. You're more deserving than you are. This community is better than that community. This school is better than that school, and punishing winners and losers, and the direction of policy in that direction. Competition, unlimited competition, the idea that I can only win if you lose, rather than this idea of we can all succeed together. Exclusion. Will we create schools and educational systems that work for all, or will we exclude people? And finally, this one's near and dear to my heart, the idea that learning is data. With testing, in the US it's Common Core, internationally we have tests such as PISA. Data is important, accountability is important, don't get me wrong, but it's gotten to the point, I believe, that I start seeing that learning is defined by a test score, and that nothing else matters. So I'll go into that a little bit more in the Situation Room, but I just think that's such an important thing. So even if you never use the word sustainability, even if you don't see yourself as really part of that world, if you're advocating for these values, to me you're doing the work of the education diplomat that also furthers the agenda of sustainability. So I think the mindsets are really key. Okay? And finally, this all boils down to the idea of what is education for? Okay? Is education for global competitiveness? Schools for private gain? Okay? There is a mentality, and again, I'm speaking from the U.S. context because that's where I am well versed. The U.S. Department of Education homepage, website, the purpose of schooling is to help students compete in the global economy. I find that very troublesome. I thought the purpose of schooling was to create well-rounded, healthy, happy, engaged citizens who can contribute to a sustainable future and a peaceful world for all. That's what I thought schools were for, okay? But apparently not. So I find that very damaging, and then when that's the mindset that schools are for private gain, then that drives policies. Competition, test scores will define you, and all of the other elements that make for a well-rounded individual, that help us understand if we're developing a sustainable and healthy society, that doesn't even count. On the other hand, what if we had education for global collaboration, schools for the public good, schools for a sustainable future? And so I think one of the key takeaways for education diplomats is what vision will we advocate for? What will we do? What message will we bring? Who are the allies that we will bring into the conversation? Because I think that the way we answer this question will very heavily determine the future of our society. Thank you.